And we're joined now by two representatives from the Domestic Violence Unit. We're joined by Judge Jose Lopez. Judge, thank you very much for joining us. And Natalia Otero, tell us what your group, you're from Safe DC, is that right?
DC Safe.
DC Safe, thank you.
We're a nonprofit organization.
And what does your group do?
Our group works in conjunction with the court to make sure there's a coordinated community response to domestic violence.
So are you doing outreach for victims? Is it prevention? Is that part of your mandate, what you do as well?
We do crisis intervention work, which means that we're in the DC Superior Court accompanying clients to court, to the civil protection order hearings. We also have advocates in the Domestic Violence Intake Center drafting civil protection orders and referring clients out to legal representation.
Judge Lopez, you preside over the Domestic Violence Unit. Give us a little bit of a window into what kind of things go on inside of your courtrooms.
Well, most significant is, first of all, is the petition for temporary protection order. Those are emergency orders that people come on the same day because there is some danger to their safety that they require an immediate order. So that we get a lot of those, and they just come in at all times.
So I guess we would think of that as a stay-away order.
A stay-away order of a temporary nature is an emergency action.
So this is someone who feels threatened by someone else and comes to court. Now, say someone comes in and says, hey, I want a stay-away order against that guy, Mark Seagraves.
Yeah.
Do I have any say in that, or is it just I get a piece of paper saying stay away from Jane Doe?
The temporary order is an emergency thing, and you're not going to be there. That one is only good for 2 weeks, however. That's just enough because there's an immediate danger, and there's no time to get Mark Seagraves into the courtroom on that day, because on the same day the person will get the order. But then you must be served with a paper so that 2 weeks later, then everybody must appear in court in order to determine who is correct about the allegations.
And at that point, could that stay-away order be extended?
Yes, it could be extended to the extent that the case may not go forward, or to the extent that there's a hearing and it's determined that you did commit the act, and therefore then they could get a civil protection order that's good for 12 months. And
does that go on my public record then?
It is a public record, but it's not a criminal record.
And so who has access to that? If my employer or somebody I want to do business with or go to the bank I want to get a loan from, do they have access to that kind of information?
They do not have access to that kind of information. The only people that really have access to that kind of information is law enforcement people.
And then what else does your court do besides these protective orders?
Besides the protective orders, then we have what is called the criminal cases, where somebody has committed a domestic violence crime and the prosecutor determines that this should be tried as a criminal act. We also have those kinds of cases.
And give me some numbers. How many protective orders are you issuing on I don't know how you measure them, a monthly basis, and how many domestic violence cases are coming through your courts?
Well, last year, for example, we had approximately 4,700 cases in the civil protection order area, and we had about 2,700 cases in the criminal domestic violence area.
And so let me ask you, when does your group come in? At what point do you take note of what's going on and then and enter the scene?
We actually have an emergency response line that is housed in the court and is available to all of the first responders in the city. So many times we go out and meet with the victim after the incident has occurred. So the police come out to a scene of the crime, talk to the victim, offer her services. If they agree, we get on the phone with them. We send an advocate out to meet with them and talk to them about what their options are. We may provide emergency shelter, we may provide transportation, but then the next day we are in court with them, helping them decide whether or not they want to go forward.
You know, as a reporter, I think one of the things that I take away from these kinds of cases over the years is that they go underreported. I think that's kind of the maybe the untold story, is that a lot of these domestic violence cases go underreported, and a lot of times it's because it's families, and they're afraid that the husband would go to jail, and that's their source of income, or people will get deported. Is that still as much of a problem? What is the policy if somebody calls your hotline and they're not in the country legally?
We are not law enforcement. We don't ask those sorts of questions.
And you don't pass that information along?
No, our major concern really is determining whether the client is in a group that we would call high lethality cases. So we try to determine whether the person that is calling the police or seeking assistance is at higher risk for serious injury, death, and we try to look at it that way. So our main goal really is to make sure that the client has immediate safety, tangible services, and access to our services, but also to the other partners in the intake center, and more importantly, to the legal system.
What about when they're in your courtroom?
Yeah, the last thing we want to do is discourage people from looking for help because of their concern about legal matters that have nothing to do with safety. So there are no questions asked about whether people are from another country, whether they are here legally or not. None of that. We really are concerned about protecting rights, and we don't enforce the immigration laws. That's not our job.
And give me some demographic information. I'm guessing that the victims are primarily women. Is that correct?
The victims are primarily women, and one of the things that has always been surprising is that the vast majority are not people that are married. They're people that have a child together, they live together, those kind of situations.
Don't go anywhere. We'll have more of this conversation when NewsPlus returns. Welcome back to NewsPlus. I'm Mark Seagraves, and now more of my conversation about domestic violence in Washington, D.C. Can you tell me about the victims and their age range, and do you offer services to teenagers?
We do, yes. I think the most important thing to note really is that domestic violence is a learned behavior. It does come from the home. People aren't born batterers or victims. However, children who grow up in homes where domestic violence occurs are more likely to either become victims or become batterers. So there is some link there. The majority of our clients are women. However, we do see about 5% Latino and about 1% male victims. We're lucky to have a relationship with other nonprofit organizations like Break the Cycle, who work specifically with young women. Our demographic is on the medium 30-year-olds, 25 to 30-year-old. And
Judge Lopez, I know you also oversee visitations, is that right? And tell me how this works. These, I guess, are people who, parents who don't have custody of their children but have visitation rights, and the court oversees this?
What happens is we undertake everything that's necessary to keep peace in the family. So if there are children involved, then we'll deal with the question of custody, and then we'll also deal with the question of visitation and how to make visitation work in light of the differences that the parties are going through.
And when I know they do this in Prince George's County when it comes to domestic violence units, that they try to centralize all of the services so that particularly the victims don't have to go from agency to agency, from building to building. Is that how it is in D.C.? Is it kind of a one-stop shop?
We have a one-stop shop, the intake center, as Ms. Otero was saying. They come up there, and in that center we have the advocates, we have the U.S. Attorney's Office, we have Metropolitan Police, and other various agencies as the need will arise in order to give them all the services in that one area.
Now, is this a problem? Let me ask you, is this a problem that's getting better or worse?
I think that's hard to tell. I think we're learning a lot about how to prevent things. I think we're also learning a lot about prevention. But I think we're also learning a lot about how victims access services, what makes services more accessible, and what is going to stop the cycle quickly and efficiently. I think part of that is what we try to do with our crisis intervention programming. We've learned that if a victim is provided tangible services within 48 hours, that they are more likely to follow the process. The other thing we know is that there was one of the larger studies about civil protection orders is that in 80% of the cases, the violence, the further violence and stalking does stop while a civil protection order is actually in place. Of course, there's always that 20% of the cases that we're most concerned with who are either not reaching out or not seeking legal remedies.
And Judge Lopez, let me ask you, do you know how the numbers are trending as far, I guess the worst case scenario is this ends in murder. And how are those numbers trending? I know we see in D.C. the homicide rate is going down dramatically, But I also know from having Chief Lanier on this show for so many years that she says the vast majority of violent crimes and homicide are between people who know one another, and quite frequently it's domestic related.
Well, in the domestic violence area, the rate of homicide back in 2011, there were approximately 13, and in 2012 there were 6. So there is an improvement. Of course, any death is not good enough, but there is an improving trend, definitely.
And we think about domestic violence. We think about people being hit, beaten, killed. But is it psychological? Is it verbal? Can it be not physical and still be abuse and still be against the law?
Well, I will let him answer the against the law part, but there is definitely physical abuse. I mean, we normally look at it as tactics. So the reason that these relationships are so volatile is because their power dynamics are different than a healthy relationship. The abuser will do whatever they can to get the victim to do what they want that victim to do, and in order to do that, they use several tactics, which can include emotional abuse, abuse through the children, economic abuse. So obviously those are psychological abuse. What ends up happening, though, is that if a victim is not being controlled, then the abuse then increases, whether it increases in severity in terms of emotional and mental abuse, but eventually it almost always leads to violence, especially in the situation where the victim has decided to end the relationship. So once the victim has ended the relationship, the abuser will go through all of that abuse, and we see it when we are in court with victims. You know, it increases in the number of calls, in going to that victim's workplace, in stalking, harassing, and then certainly violence.
So let me ask you, short of physical abuse, if somebody comes to your courtroom and they want a protective order for someone who's just calling me or just being verbally abusive or somehow psychologically tormenting me. I mean, I get it. Maybe it's like pornography. I know it when I see it. Does that rise to the level of protective order?
That will rise to the level. In fact, when they come for the temporary protection order, if the judge can determine that the actions are a danger to the welfare of the individual, that's enough to grant the temporary protection order. It's not just the safety, but the welfare.
Well, we appreciate you both coming in here and sharing your stories with us about what you both do on this front.